And I would like to thank very much HDR for organizing this fantastic event. Well, let me be American. It's a fantastic event. And especially my friend Daphne Lava. So this paper presents the work of Solar Cities, as you can see here, a working group that started 3 years ago within the framework of a research financed by the John S. Latsis Public Benefit Foundation. The group's aim was to produce a comprehensive educational tool for understanding cultural practices and cultural heritage through the ethnographic documentation of the soundscapes of the city. It is a multifaceted educational resource which is accessible via WordPress website. Again, this is the interface, hosted by the University of Athens server. And actually, I wanted to show you how it works, but the server is down right now because there is an occupation at the Turkish Studies Department. Through a combination of theoretical discussion, guided fieldwork, and dynamic digital representations of the city soundscapes, Solar Cities aspires to the fields of both academic and public history. The public humanities part of this project deals both with its educational component and its technological application, as I will tell you later. It uses as its case study Salonika, a city characterized by silence, absence, eradication, and oblivion regarding its past. The project emerged at a time in which a number of historical works started to appear regarding this past, stressing the multicultural and multi-confessional past of the city. Of course, the most prominent of this was Mark Mazaro's Salonika, City of Ghosts, but also a series of other works like David Barr's work on the history of the Dome community. I will talk about this as this is a central part of this project. And this is also an interesting timing because it is a moment right now in which the local authorities, for the first time, I think, since many years, started to show an active interest in this troubled past. Now, by focusing on sound, sorry, this is just an image of Salonika as it was, and you can see the panorama of the minarets in the city before 1912. By focusing on sound, the project contributes to the field of sensory history, a type of history that examines the social and cultural history of the senses. In our attempt to restore the oral rather than the visual dimension of modernity in our project, we focused on the history of sound and sound history, both of which recognize that senses are historical, meaning that it is not that listening is not universal or hearing, but rather a product of place and time, culturally constructed and historically defined. Our objective was to attack a number of hegemonic certainties of modern sound culture. A, that music is not the only sound in the city. B, that vision is not stronger than hearing. And C, and most importantly, that sounds are not only heard, but also sensed. In order to make sense of past sounds, but also as a means to historicize the practice of hearing, we try to extrapolate sounds from a variety of conventional sources, like maps and site plans, legal documents, travelers' accounts, literary allusions, and less conventional ones, like surviving structures and landscape features. We posed the following question in the analysis of our sources. A, which were the sounds of another time? B, how were they listened to and evaluated according to a system of affect that is now lost to us? And C, what does this tell us regarding a different relation to the world and to the sacred, as well as to a distinct way of being inscribed in and of experiencing time and space? This sensory and acoustic reading allows us to comprehend the procedures involved in the construction of identities, both at an individual and on a community level. In the first place, our intention was to focus on soundscapes in an urban context in transition. Soundscapes provide access to overlapping acoustic communities to which they are meaningful and intelligible. The various sound marks of these communities, ranging from religious sound practices such as church bells, calls to prayer, to the sounds of craftsmen and music making, shape individual and collective identities, ethnic and gendered and religious and professional identities, and help community members make sense of urban culture overall and of the transformation that and the transformations that occur within the context of the city. Salonika qualifies beyond doubt as such a modern city, since it has undergone over the first half of the 20th century a rapid transformation of its soundscapes that both reflect and articulate changes in its social and material fabric. Now, even though the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the transition to the nation-states has been a broadly researched theme in historical studies, a sensory or sound approach to history has not yet been adequately explored. Our aim was to trace those sound marks that corresponded to people's changing everyday lives in a passage from a multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-religious context to a mono-ethnic, Hellenocentric, Christian Orthodox one, which involved silence, omissions, and appropriations. The case study that we used, and this is just a map of Salonika, is Yeni Cami, an extraordinary monument of late Ottoman architectural eclecticism, built in 1902 by the Italian architect Vitaliano Poselli to cover the religious needs of the Ma'amin community, the Judeo-Spanish speaking Muslim converts, otherwise known as the Don Me, which perfectly reflects the conditions of these multiple passages. The project aims, this is just some other images, to historicize the dramatic changes in people's everyday lives at the end of the Ottoman Empire in Salonika, providing a sensory and corporeal understanding of the cultural practices of life in the neighborhood around the mosque during the transition from the pre-modern to modern cityscape. And I'm thinking here about the urban expansion of the city and the periodicity that, for example, the tram and its sounds created, but also the transition from the imperial environments to the nation state in the teens and 20s and beyond. The soundscape outside the Yeni Cami was irreversibly transformed, not so much after the incorporation of Salonika to the Greek kingdom in 1912, but especially after the influx of refugees from Asia Minor and the departure of Muslims, including Don Mes, with the end of the Greco-Turkish War and the subsequent population exchange in 1923. It was marked by the absence of the voice of the muezzin. Actually, the azan and the voice of the azan continued to be heard between 1912 and 1923, which is a very interesting transitional moment. And there are multiple articles at the press of the time talking about the awkwardness of the azan. But it stops being heard after 1923. Actually, the minaret itself outside the Yeni Cami would be demolished a few years later. And also by speech community, which was gradually turning linguistically homogeneous, whereby Greek would eventually prevail. This was a multi-linguistic neighborhood par excellence. The surrounding area hosted a web of private and public structures of aid and relief towards the noisy symbiosis of Asia Minor refugees, because the Yeni from 1923 to 1925 interestingly stopped working as it started functioning as a mosque. It started functioning as a refugee shelter. So we tried to cover this through the oral history archive of Asia Minor refugees and how this entire soundscape changed. And finally, let me just show you, these are some images. This is a carte postale of the Yeni Cami, and these are some images of the mosque before 1923. This is an image of Hagia Sophia, an Orthodox, one of the important Orthodox churches in the city, which was also used as a refugee shelter between 1923 and 1925. Unfortunately, we couldn't find photographs of Yeni Cami as a refugee shelter, but it shouldn't be very different from what you see here. Finally, and I think this is the important moment, in 1925 there is this crucial decision that was made to turn the Yeni Cami, which was called, it was a so-called exchangeable building, Andalaximon, into the city's first archaeological museum. So it was part of a wider project of Hellenization of the city, and this particular quarter of the city, formerly known as the Hamidiye district. And this is the document of the General Office of Exchange assigning the building to the Ephorate of Antiquities. The 1926 refurbishment of the building constituted a signpost in its history in the context of the transition from a religious building to the city's first archaeological museum. The refurbishment acted as a rite of passage from one usage to the next, including sound and silencing. The detailed record that you can see here of the refurbishment described, among other things, the removal of the pulpit, the minbar, from where the imam of the mosque performed his sermons, and its transfer actually to Hagia Sophia. The significance of this document for sketching the sound history of this particular building is far greater than the epilogue to the story of the Islamic praying practice in the city. It narrates the story of the major demographic shift that took place in the city in the first quarter of the 20th century, following all these series of major political events, and demonstrating at the same time a major shift in the city's religious soundscape. It exemplifies how every transition from mosque to refugee shelter, and eventually from refugee shelter to the first archaeological museum, that every transition silenced the previous function of this space. Now, this observation brings me to the fact that Sonor Cities is firmly premised not only in the history of the senses and sound history, but also in the ethnographic approach, and thereby in the methodological and epistemological field of anthropology. We try to produce alternative routes into the archive and develop navigating skills that allowed us to trespass the formal institutional taxonomic rules. The cross-reading of administrative and legal documents, for instance, like this one, aims to facilitate the understanding of how a specific sound practice, which is politically regulated and politically implemented, leaves its trace on archival documents and written texts. In our study of the soundscape of Yeni Cami during the first decades of the 20th century, our field interlocutors therefore were not only people, but also archives, documents, material culture, and objects from the past. Two key questions that we tried to pose on administrative and legal texts were, let's put it in one key question, was how we can tell the story of the religious life and the praying practices of the Muslim community of the city, and to what extent it conveys the full picture. Now, legal documents, of course, offer a top-down narrative. We were challenged by the task of exploring that space in the full picture, inhabited by those individuals who do not have a voice in legal documents. In our case study, this challenge relates to how the members of the Muslim or Dome community experienced a massive shift in the auditory world from 1912 onwards. We have a number of other sources like epigraphs, inscriptions, tomes, and in general, fragments of material culture of all sorts that form such alternative material sources. Among the epigraphic components of the Yeni Cami that have been preserved, we found Ottoman inscriptions, like this one, which, apart from being relics of the Ottoman past, contributed to the ritual of the conversion of the mosque into a museum. This practice, which entailed the ritualistic destruction of these remains, equaled the hiding, deleting, or maybe silencing of the archive through its sensory neutralization. As anthropologist Nathias Ermetakis argued, items of older periods and other cultures, which had had their particular aromatic, tactile, and auditory realities, are often desensualized. It is for that matter that rather than the plain reading of the epigraphic record as a monument of historical facts, we were also interested in their materiality and the affect that they generated. Now, to change gears to digital history, these are just some photographs of Denizami and its later reincarnation as the first archaeological museum. This is a carte postale which says Musée Archéologique. And this is how it looked inside, and you can see that it had changed very much. And another photograph. But to shift to digital history and the attempt to establish and interpret links between culture, materiality, memory, and the historical narratives of the past, our prerogative as Solar Cities was to popularize our results in terms of the public history, which prompted us to create a digital cultural history bag. The digitization of a huge number of cultural and material artifacts and the emergence and dissemination of new tools for storing, accessing, manipulating, navigating, and visualizing primary data made us pose the following question. If in the digital era the aura of print is indeed passing, what about the material traces and the chronotype of the senses? Can the image, the sound, the textual asset, even the senses of touch and smell, and general sensorial experiences be transmitted, of course, through representation, through digital media? It is moreover the digital humanities undermining of the traditional linear text-based narrative in its tropes that corresponded to the priorities of sound history that intrigued us, while at the same time this idea of introducing a collaborative, interdisciplinary, project-based model of scholarship. The epistemological and methodological transformation of the rendering of cultural history with the help of computational techniques, therefore, was this challenge that we had to face. The next step was the integration of an open source web tool that entailed web mapping, content management, and visualization techniques into the history process. Part of our project, conceptualized both as an educational tool as well as one that would facilitate the public diffusion of all these findings, was the creation of a digital pilot. You can see here again the pilot. It's the pilot application of the Solar Cities digital interactive educational resource through the Visual Eyes tool. Let me tell you one or two things about Visual Eyes. It's an open web-based authoring scholarly tool written in Adobe Flash and developed at the University of Virginia that intends to weave images, maps, charts, video, and data into interactive and compelling dynamic visualizations. This is from the tool site. It says, Visualize enables scholars to present selected primary source materials and research findings while encouraging active inquiry and hands-on learning among general and targeted audience. So we have created an abstract organizational model in order to handle the heterogeneous primary material sources that we had, including photographs, text extracts, audio recordings, architectural plans, and the epigraphs that I talked about. The model of Solar Cities, digital resource, flirts with the fruitful interplay of space and time. Again, unfortunately, I cannot show you all this. I can just show you parts of the interface, but there is a timeline that is structured according to four moments, the four moments that we categorized, 1902 to 1922, which is the mosque, 1923 to 1925, the refugee shelter, 1925 to 1962, the archaeological museum, and then from 1986 to the present, when the museum turned into an arts venue of the municipality of Thessaloniki, which is under construction. Our idea was that the structure of the senses, of the various phases of Yenidjami, can be reconstructed through a web of flexible interconnections among and between soundscapes, located in distinct space and time, what in digital resources termed word clouds. So while the user chooses to explore the soundscapes of the Yenidjami's refugee shelter phase, the word clouds, and you can see some of them, minaret, orality, senscape, symbiosis, in the navigation control panel, generate a number of text displays of different colors, each one for each word cloud. Actually, again, in this dynamic way, you can press each one of this, and what pops up is a different source, either a legal document, an administrative document, a diary, or even a voice from an oral history from the Kalamaria Asia Minor refugee collection. Our aim was to engage digital technologies not as an assistive component, but as the epicenter of our own conceptualization and research, reducing its dearth of technical documentation and metadata issues. So the idea was to be as user-friendly as possible. Finally, based on the Yenidjami case studies, SonorCity produced a teacher handbook, namely an open access digital publication in the philosophy of the Creative Commons. So you can download it online, and these are some of the tasks of the teacher handbook. It's a publication aimed to contain material that is necessary for setting up and carrying out the project both in the classroom and in the field, with a number of material like tables and activities for students and instructors. The handbook allows for the creation of a pedagogical model of learning, which has also a community-situated field workplace in mind. And these are some moments in which we try to reach out to a wider community. This is from the Athens Science Festival, and again, some other moments in which we tried to diffuse it outside the classroom. Just trying to wrap it up, the SonorCity project of learning culture through soundscapes departs from a specific case study, again, the Yenidjami of Salonika, to pose a number of fundamental questions to the public humanities. How do we deal with heterogeneous collected archival material in a way that transcends the existing taxonomic typologies and invigorates the linear historical narrative mode? In the era of new media and digital technologies, what are the alternate routes or models to historicize the sound archive? Is a database structure of the archival material enough for the researchers' multisensorial questions? And how can a field-based scholar become a digital-oriented scholar? Finally, how can we place a wider audience or readership center stage, increasing public access to these findings? And again, a public access to the complex past. The pedagogical framework of SonorCities includes much more than the classroom and the fieldwork. Affirming its identity as a multi-layered ethnography of sound, as well as a digital humanities project, it tried to enhance the use of open data and existing open scholarly tools such as Visualize. In this collaborative project, we tried to combine the community and the public engagement. And this because both the pilot and the handbook ascribe to a different model of teaching and of knowledge diffusion. Again, allowing for more participation and public engagement and feedback, so a more dynamic exchange. To finish up, this is a kind of research that promoted by this project that we must limit between the academic and the public history. Therefore, inscribing to the tendency recently exemplified by Joe Gouldis and David Armitage in the History Manifesto of promoting the public future of the past, exploring both sounds and silences and their interconnection. Thank you.